Welcome everybody to our latest panel discussion on regenerative design, building the future we need. This approach to design can play a huge role in securing a greener and more stable future around the world, if it is, of course, implemented correctly. Obviously, it's so much more than just green roofs, but what does regenerative design done right look like? Can it have a positive impact on nature and biodiversity? Can it even the playing field for vulnerable communities? And can it be scaled up globally? Well, we're about to find out the answers to all of this and more in today's session. We would love for you to continue the discussion on social media. Please do tag us at RSK Group and use the hashtag Green Dialogues. You can find us on Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter simply by searching at RSK Group. We have a fantastic lineup of speakers today, but before we hear from them, a few housekeeping notes. All attendees' microphones are automatically muted throughout the webinar. During the presentation, you are highly encouraged to post questions for our speakers, and there will be a Q&A session at the end of all of the presentations. We'll answer as many questions as possible, but those that can't be due to time constraints will be answered after the webinar. Shortly after today's panel ends, you will receive a link to a short survey. If you could take a few minutes to provide feedback so we can improve on future webinars, that would be very much appreciated. Now I'd like to welcome our first speaker, Andrew Tempany, Landscape Architect and Technical Director at Stevenson Halliday, an RSK company. Hi, Andrew.
Hi, Lucy.
Andrew is a landscape architect specializing in nature-based solutions, green infrastructure, and strategic approaches to design for resilience and nature recovery. I will leave you be to kick us off.
Thanks very much, Lucy. Good afternoon, everyone. Over the next 8 minutes or so, I'm going to set out my take on regenerative design and 5 themes I've observed around it so we can build the future we all need and want. This is a brief overview of what I'm going to cover over the next few minutes. And starting with the way we were, I guess regenerative design as a way of thinking stems back to nature, natural systems, and life on the land. Taking some of the references from the image from the dreaming on the left, we were designed as humans to be connected to nature, to use Thor Heyerdahl's words. We were also evolved for life on land. Landscapes were central to our lives, where and how we grew our food, use of grains and water for brewing when drinking the water itself was too toxic to contemplate, and where we chose to site our cities, towns, and villages. So symbiotic associations or circular processes began to form. Okay, so this image here is on a very grand scale, and it's for the few rather than the many. It's Castleberry Park, as it was in its heyday. But the thing this image shows is closed loop and sustainable design and management processes. Yes, they're set primarily in the guise of a landed estate, with all its trappings of privilege, status, and wealth, but the woodlands and bosques for game benefited from silviculture, extending the life of the trees, generating products and creating species-rich networks of habitats. And silvicultural systems also create the kind of beautiful, biodiverse and life-affirming places like Ashridge and its bluebells, as we see in this image here. Another example of regenerative land management is the old photo on the right. It's the place where I'm from, a living, working river valley where our family's mill gave the river its head of water and its flow, helping the management of species-rich flood meadows and the creation of watercress beds. So again, productive landscapes and living systems working together in virtuous circles. But industrialization and large-scale urbanization over the last 250 or so years, plus things like superscaling and industrialization of agriculture, have, I think, combined to remove our contact with the land and with nature, natural systems and processes and the seasons. And I would also suspect also our knowledge of cause and effect, or links between choices we make and consequences. So this might all point to where we've gone wrong. I'm not for 1 minute suggesting we can't have things, but I think it's about understanding of links between choices and consequences. Informed choices, understanding not just our first, but also second or third stage impact of our choices in terms of consumption, where things came from, and what the environmental and ecological impacts of those things were. So regenerative design can be a really good way to reverse some of the damage through going beyond restoration and renewal, mimicking natural processes and applying whole systems thinking to give back more than we take out. This is great for environmental and social resilience, for more mindful modes of living and working, and contributing solutions to societal challenges around climate and biodiversity, as well as facilitating more equitable futures. I think many of us will have seen variants of this diagram. On the left, business as usual, the lowest common denominator, then so-called green design and sustainable design, which is often just about breaking even or no net loss or restoring the status quo through mitigation at significant effect. We need to raise the bar to achieve resilience and equality and to be part of the solution, not the problem. And so to the aspirational marks on the right of where we should be, restorative design, and then the whole system's participatory gold standard of regenerative design. So I'm going to show some brief examples of our team's work in the restorative and regenerative space. On the left, the landscape design and now natural capital accounting for a resource recovery park of circular partnerships between renewable energy and energy-intensive industries. In the middle, our master plan for an extension to a historic Chartist settlement, where we use the historic references of the Chartist aspiration to life on land to guide a landscape design founded on food growing, edible landscapes, community horticulture and cohesion. And finally, perhaps more of a nature-based solution, but there is a crossover, a wilding scheme we're delivering as part of a large infrastructure project with our colleagues at RSK Wilding. Why now? I think we all know the sort of reasons as to why now, but this is just a really brief recap on some of the big picture issues that we're facing and what Timothy Morton would call hyper-objects, to which regenerative design and other related things like nature-based solutions and natural climate solutions and so on can help start to contribute ideas and solutions. And of course, the related concepts which paint a somber picture, like the exceedance of 4 of the 9 planetary boundaries defined by Stockholm University. What I'm going to do now is set out 5 principles for realising regenerative futures through design. These, I think, to be some extent, there'll be things that you all recognise, and I'm going to go through these quickly, as Louise, Jessie and Jerry, our other speakers, will be expanding on some of them shortly. So number 1, think in big circles. Think of Venn diagrams where solutions to problems overlap. Back to our resource recovery part for a moment and the underlying circular design rationale and circular economy, the links between renewable energy and energy-intensive industry, the local to global integration of the client's CSR ideals of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and also how our landscape setting for the design went way beyond essential mitigation to realise large-scale nature connectivity and restoration. Or our modern interpretation of that Chartist ideal, using historic research and the essence of the place as a cue for a permaculture-inspired, community-focused landscape design, linking past, present and future, and laying the foundations for healthier, kinder communities through community horticulture and using that to drive design. Second principle, there's no place for silos, ever. Okay, so this is a bit of a flippant slide in a way, but it makes the point. The results of metaphorical silos or design by them are often the same as the literal equivalent, I think. And I think we've probably all experienced something like the scenario on the left. Silos are outmoded relics, but sadly they're often alive and well, when in actual fact it should be about all the things on the right. Interdisciplinary design is about mutual respect, listening to and understanding other perspectives, using skill gaps as opportunities to learn, bring people on board and diversify design teams. Above all, it's about never losing sight of the bigger picture or the vision you seek to achieve, and by extension, using this collaborative, participatory approach to engaging the community who will live with your projects. Thirdly, regenerative design is not just about creativity, but also pragmatism, good evidence-based rationale and good metrics. For example, looking at ecosystem services and functions and overlaying and questioning data spatially, we can often see related patterns and opportunities for multifunctional design solutions to begin realizing net zero and net gain aspirations. And a recent and beautiful example of evidence design, of course, is Stefano Borri's famous Bosco Verticale in Milan. As a vertical forest, it responds to the concept of the city forest of Bosco in Città, which has guided Milan's urban planning for about 40 years now. Thousands of trees, shrubs and herbaceous plants were contract grown to the required size and for the required aspects of the individual elevations of the 2 residential towers, making measurable contributions to urban biodiversity, UV filtration, shading, cooling and passive insulation, as well as dust and particulate filtration. And fourthly, linked to all of these ideas, map your project's priorities, outcomes and beneficiaries. Map them again and note the relationships and opportunities, and use this as a tool to positively guide design development. I guess it's thinking outside the box or thinking outside compartments by another name, really. Metrics and data-driven mapping of benefit flows can be a really helpful process here too, as we see with this example of a logic chain around ecosystem services on the right. And fifth and finally, good regenerative design is not just a kind of way of thinking, but it's also a roadmap. an evolving drawing where you can rub bits out and change them as better ideas present themselves or as new evidence comes to light. It's important to have a compelling vision so that people can get behind it, but it shouldn't be set in stone or so inflexible that it can't evolve and improve. So think agile and flexible. Yes, there is clearly a case for once in a lifetime special and iconic projects, but equally valuable to mainstreaming equitable and resilient futures are ones that are scalable and replicable too. And that's it from me now, so thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for kicking us off to such a strong start. I'd love to know how you think true collaboration can be achieved to secure regenerative design outcomes.
Okay, that's a really good question. Thank you. I think it really comes in two parts. It's professional and community collaboration from my kind of view. First, there's the open, mutually respectful type of workplace collaboration I alluded to. So the right team for the right project, all the right specialists and skills without doubling up. But very often the systems-based approaches and metrics that we need to achieve net zero across all fronts are such that they require that kind of input. And that's a really great leveler for collaboration. But with things like the United Nations SDGs, which regenerative design is very kind of bound up with, it's all about the receiving community. And I think that's where collaboration clearly extends to our end users, those people that will hopefully benefit from our projects. So really stakeholder mapping and analysis and good engagement and open questions to listen to what they want and community wants and needs is really essential, and doing that proportionally and essentially not assuming that we can second guess what they want. It's all about talking to them and above all listening.
Definitely. And you talk a lot about scale and scalability. Given the nature of the challenges we face, how effective do you think these regenerative approaches can be?
Right. First of all, I would say that regenerative design is probably only part of the solution alongside things like nature-based solutions, natural climate solutions. It's a kind of way of thinking rather than sort of processes as such, I guess. And it links to other things like regenerative agriculture and nature recovery networks too. Scale and scalability is clearly a really important part of successful regenerative design. And I think we shouldn't underestimate the incremental benefit of smaller replicable projects that could contribute to a wider regenerative vision or network, or sort of local action to kind of achieve those things as well. And they might actually be the things that give the most immediate benefit to a community or to people's lives, or have the most kind of measurable impact to them. Because that sort of people principle is another really important part of it. It's doing things that strike a chord with people, or the people principle, as I sometimes call it. And that's one really great way we can bring regenerative design approaches into the mainstream, which is exactly where they need to be.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much again. We're going to see you later on when you rejoin us for the Q&A session.
Thank you.
But I'm going to ask our next speaker to turn his camera on, Jerry Tate, Director at Tate Co Architects. Hi, Jerry. So Jerry founded Tate Co in 2007 and maintains a central role at the practice. Tate & Co specialise in sustainable buildings in sensitive landscape or heritage settings. Their clients include the Eden Project, the National Trust and York St John University. Current projects include large-scale master plans, education facilities for schools and universities, 2 country house hotels and a number of landscape-based visitor attractions. Can't wait to hear what you've got to talk to us about today. I will disappear.
Thank you, Lucy. That's brilliant. Yes, no, hello, hi everybody. So I'm Jerry, and this is a sort of 8-minute talk really. Just it's about regenerative design, but it's really about the sort of thinking in big circles thing that that Andrew was talking about, you know, a minute ago. And yeah, I think broadly it's a really positive discussion. What is really positive about it is regenerative design is one of these things where sustainability is quite often about using less. And regenerative design is about having a positive impact, and it's things like, you know, how do you make a scheme that gives you better health, better food, better lifestyle, better connection to nature and the community, and all those kind of things. So I think it's potentially, you know, a really sort of powerful way of thinking through the design process. So just to briefly introduce us, Tate Co, we're an architecture practice. We're based in Dalston, East London, but we do work all over the UK and to a certain degree internationally as well. This is us. I'm one of 3 directors. This is us in our offices. So it's not a bad portrait really, because there's lots of natural materials, plants, and bikes. So there you go, that's what we like. And then this is the kind of work we get up to. So as Lucy said, we have a certain sort of client base, but we tend to work on projects where sustainability meets landscape meets community, really. And we do a lot of work in sensitive landscape and heritage settings. So sort of strange place to start. Well, not really actually, because Andrew touched on this as well. But we do a lot of work for the National Trust, and the kind of work we do tends to be making what the National Trust have got, which is these sort of large stately homes, more accessible, basically, and making them something that was sort of in a slightly off-putting way, a huge kind of resource for a single family, becomes something which is kind of publicly accessible. So on the left, there's something we're doing at Clumber Park, which is a kind of ghost mansion representing a mansion that was destroyed in 1938, and on the right, for example, this is Belton House, Wilderness Woods, where we made quite a large playground and mini train station for the National Trust. And although partly the kind of history of country houses is a little bit distasteful in a way, actually the more you work on them, the more you understand. And again, Andrew touched on this, that they're really amazing examples of sort of semi-closed loop systems that actually preserved historic examples. And so, the food that was consumed on a country estate came from the walled garden. The fuel that fired it quite often was from coppiced woods. The water came from a local water source. There was an orchard to create fruit. I mean, it was very much something where, there was a closed loop system, and the sun was the thing that was providing the energy. And actually on the bottom here, that's a closed loop system that we did for a sort of modern country house that we're doing in Suffolk at the moment, quite a large scale, contemporary but new version of this. And it's easy to look at these and get a bit nostalgic and think, oh, they had it right in the Victorian era. But the truth is, when say Clumber was in its heyday in the mid 19th century, there was 25 million people in the UK and 1.5 billion people globally. Now there are 7 billion people globally. So the real question is, how can we develop these systems to work at scale? And I think this sort of systems thinking is really important. It's sort of like slightly the confessional bit of the talk. But when we started Tate Co, I was the old project architect, one of the old project architects for the Eden project, and we were very into sustainability. But we did tend to look at it in a very focused way, and that focus was operational carbon. So, for example, we've done quite a lot of passive houses. So this is one of the certified passive houses we've done in Hertfordshire, for example. Sort of as we were cracking operational carbon, as we were actually genuinely creating low energy buildings, you start to get slight anxiety over all the other things that you're not really looking at. So, for example, here, this diagram is showing you where all the components come from to create that passive house in Hertfordshire. And some of them come from quite far away, particularly specialist passive house kind of components. And this affects the embodied energy in the building, actually. So this specific thing is about embodied carbon, which I know is a rising debate now in the sustainability sphere. And the reason it's a rising debate is in a normal house, this diagram just sort of demonstrates really the stats. In a normal building, the lifetime carbon emissions, 30% of it would be embodied. But once you make a really efficient building, suddenly it's more like 60%. So it becomes a much, much bigger deal in terms of your overall operational equation. And I think this is like a lesson to us, like as a company, as part of our creative practice, that we need to consider sort of multiple factors really when we're looking about whether something is a sort of genuinely positive impact on the environment and the community it's in. And it leads to how do you start to create a sort of feedback loop system which genuinely creates a regenerative design. So I thought I'd show you this basically, which is something we've been developing for a while now. It's a design with Keyland Developments, who are part of Yorkshire Water, and a brilliant design team, including a company called 3Adapt, who I have to mention because they're really key to this, on this project, which is Esholt Positive Living. So it's between Bradford and Leeds. It's in the green belt, and actually, I don't know if you can see, but that's the Woolpack out of Emmerdale. So if any of you watch Emmerdale, that's where that is. And so we achieved planning consent in 2021, and the site is essentially a series of redundant water treatment plants, basically. And and there's an active water treatment plant as well, which produces too much heat and grey water. So that's really useful from a sort of water and energy point of view. And it consists really of, there's a development residential scheme on the top there, about 150 new homes, and then there's roughly 1 million square feet of commercial on the southern area, linked to Appley Bridge Station, all linked with a new country park owned by Yorkshire Water. And Yorkshire Water, partly because they own all the land around it, so it's like a legacy thing, but also because they have other considerations as a sort of large water supplier. They really wanted this to be an exemplar for sustainability, but not just in terms of straight carbon emissions, or in a very broad sense, so things like biodiversity, water, health, and all those kind of things. And what we did to frame the broad measure really was use something called a 6 capitals model, which is where you look really at how things are grouped into 6 capitals. So you have natural, intellectual, social, human, manufactured, and financial. And the idea is that you use that as a framing device to make sure that, you know, from where we are now in this diagram to where we are in the future in this sort of expanded diagram, that essentially all 6 capitals grow every year forever. So you're looking at all the resources available on the site and trying to work out how you can maximize their environmental and natural and social impact, if you like. And one of the things this does, one of the really interesting things is we found, was it gives you a framework with really clear guidance that you can sort of tailor your designs to. And because you're looking at growing the capitals, doesn't mean you're looking for exceptional in every case. So you can see the red line here. This is the targets we're actually going for in terms of water and energy on the site. So the water, we're going for an exceptional because it's Yorkshire Water and we should. But not all of the energy measures we're going for exceptional because we don't need to. We can still grow the capital without going for that. And I think that's important because it is unrealistic to think you're going to be able to achieve exceptional on every single front. But the other thing that the 6 capitals model gives you is quite a good kind of nudge framework to make sure that you're getting the most from your design work. So, for example, this in the middle, this is one of the public spaces in the residential development, one of the green open spaces. And the 6 capitals model has ensured that, you know, first of all, we've made this publicly accessible from Eshock Village, so it provides a sort of wider community benefit. You can see there's a series of SUDS water features, which are to do with water management. This site feeds the River Aire, and the River Aire tends to flood Leeds, so there's sort of issue there. And also, we've put as much as we can in to improve biodiversity. So it's ticking sort of 3 quite big boxes, and it's really the 6 capitals models that's nudged us to design the space in that way. And you know, I mean, this sort of broad systems-based regenerative design approach is something that we're applying to pretty much all of our projects now in the office. So, you know, and we're finding that it helps us understand and frame some sort of wider benefits for every scheme. So, for example, this is our new creative centre that we're just finishing for York St John University. So it's basically a 200-seat auditorium on the left and a recital hall on the right, and then there's 2,500 square metres of teaching space behind, and they're all linked by a sort of large timber framed atrium, which is also creating a social space for the students. And you know, there's a very broad measure here we have used for sustainability. So you know, it's a passive house standard fabric, so it's very low energy, but you know, we've used a lot of timber framing, so it's very low embodied carbon as well. We just got the measure back, and actually it's pretty good, so I'm really pleased. But also we use the scheme as a catalyst really to generate other benefits. So for example, bolted onto the design work, we created a master plan for the broader campus, which looked at decreasing the amount of hard standing, increasing the amount of green space, increasing biodiversity. So that has an environmental impact, has an ecological impact. It also helps the student community, and of course, because it's quite in the middle of the centre of York, it helps the broader York City community as well, because it's a publicly accessible site. So it's one of those things where thinking in kind of broader positive outcome terms has nudged us, if you like, into pushing the design in an extremely kind of positive but broadly good direction. And I just thought I'd finish on this really. This is one of our teaching sessions that we do in Dartmoor every year in the summer, just taking down local trees and then teaching people how to use timber and things. So it's got an educational benefit and a resource benefit, and it's good fun. And I think that, you know, honestly, as a practice, we're still grappling with how to integrate kind of regenerative design thinking and how to think about these kind of closed loop systems in our design practice. But I think we're getting better at it. And I think the more we have it in our minds as we go, the more we're finding it takes us beyond a kind of single measure of sustainability and looking at kind of a broader understanding of what success in your scheme means and how you can create a truly positive outcome for both the environment and the community. And that's that. Thank you.
I love those classes. They look amazing.
Yeah. No, they're good fun, actually, I have to say.
So I wanted to know, how can we incentivize developers to include this kind of design in their schemes?
Yeah, no, it's really good thinking. I mean, I think that's an excellent question, Lucy, because I think if I was watching this, I'd be like, well, okay, come on, but someone's got to pay for this, you know, and that is the truth, right? That, you know, developers have a lot of funding pressure on them. Someone's paying for this project, and in many ways that is kind of overriding pressure. And if you look at the 6 capitals model that I showed you, you know, only one of those capitals is finance, actually. So it's a sort of broad approach. The clients we work with who are doing regenerative design tend to have kind of right now tend to have kind of quite a legacy approach to what they're doing. So they either are maintaining long-term ownership of the land, so Yorkshire Water and York St John, that's kind of them, for example, or there's people like the church commissioners we're working with now, and they have, you know, a long-term interest in doing the right thing, if you sort of mean. They've got a bishop for housing, and they want to make sure that they're creating sustainable communities as part of their kind of land work. So it, you know, those kind of people are like an easy sell. What I would say is that I think that the point about regenerative design is it is a context-driven approach. And one of those contexts is the regulatory framework in which it operates. And at the moment, the regulatory framework pretty much only measures operational carbon, operational energy, and a little bit of biodiversity, you know. And really, there should be some way that developers who are taking a broader approach to creating positive outcomes get some reward, I think. And I think, you know, yeah, there you go.
And then whilst carbon and water are pretty clear in terms of how to measure them, some of the other aspects look a bit tougher to set clear targets on. So how can you approach these with a meaningful measure?
Yeah, again, that's a really good question. So, I mean, you know, I mean, interesting. Even on carbon, actually, there's a bit of an issue. You know, there's still a debate about precisely the methodology for measuring embodied carbon in the UK at the moment. So that's one thing. Even on something that should be quite clear cut, actually, there's still a bit of a debate. But in terms of, you know, how can you have kind of measurable outputs for things? I think there's a short term and a long term answer. And I think, you know, short term, in terms of our own projects, you know, we're having to sort of tailor clear targets with clients and measurement systems to just kind of create our own systems within which to operate. And companies like 3Adapt actually are really useful for these things because they can help you frame this debate. But for example, you know, we're working with Eden at the moment, and they're one of the things we're working with Eden on is, can we have kind of clear numerical targets for apprenticeships in projects, both at the construction stage and when they're built, and what does that mean then for the design of the building, kind of thing. So that's kind of really interesting and clear. Long term, sort of really slightly back to what I was talking about before, I think we need to have a kind of broader national conversation about what regenerative design is. So, you know, I'm really, and it's not really about regulation. I don't want to go on about, you know, making a law kind of thing, but just about how can you reward people who are doing the right thing and creating, you know, regenerative schemes that have a broadly more positive outcome than just looking at carbon, basically. So yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, thank you so much, Jerry. We're again going to see you at the end for our Q&A. And next up, I will invite Louise Tricklebank, who is an independent environmental planning consultant, to join us on screen. Hi, Louise.
Hi.
So Louise is an environmental planner with 20 years of experience working in the international development and UK environment sectors. She's worked across the UK, Europe, Asia, and Africa. Now an independent consultant, Louise previously worked for several consultancy firms, including land use consultants and at the Geodata Institute at the University of Southampton. She specialises in working at the landscape scale, using ecosystem service and nature-based approaches She's worked extensively on embedding environmental and sustainability considerations into policy and the planning system at all scales and stages, and has significant knowledge and experience of land use, natural resources, and spatial planning. I am very much looking forward to hearing what you have to say, so I will disappear and leave you to it.
That's great. Thank you, Lucy. And I'm just really pleased to be able to be part of this discussion today. It's a really interesting new emerging area. So let's see if this works. There we go. So I just want to give you a few thoughts really on sort of these two priorities about informed decision making and also mapping out priorities and how they actually help us realise regenerative design. And regenerative design, it forces you to think bigger, broader, collaborate more, all of these things, big circles that Jerry and Andrew were talking about. And actually that can be a bit overwhelming. Where do you start with that? And although regenerative design is a fairly new way of thinking, informed decision making and mapping out priorities is well established in other fields of work. And I really want to this afternoon just draw on my experience of working in the policy sector in the UK and also in the international development aid sector to highlight ways that experience can really help us realise regenerative futures. So, first thing you need to do is you need to know where you're going, but there isn't always a map. And I never give up an opportunity to embarrass my children, so that's the story behind that slide. But I always think a really good place to start on a project is at the end. You really have to know what you're aiming for. And I think what we often do in projects is we sort of misunderstand where that end point is. A brief might ask us what, will tell us what we need to deliver, what the output is. That might be social housing or a new park. And there might even be sort of reference to a few outcomes that want to be achieved, like increased community cohesion, or, you might get a hint of a few things. But very often briefs are really unambitious. And, we're in the middle of a climate and biodiversity and land degradation crisis. And I think we've really all got to think, in 20 years' time, will we look back and think that we did enough? Or will we be slightly kicking ourselves that we didn't push things a bit more? And we've really got to sort of think what problems we're trying to solve and for who. And we can easily deliver these outputs like social housing without ever actually solving the problems that underlie it. So I think we need to really think about where that endpoint is a bit harder. And actually we need to be more impact-led in our work. And regenerative design really seeks to deliver that long-term impact. And that might be things, it's a sort of, it is the difference between outcomes and impact, I suppose, is the outcomes can still be relatively short term, and impact is really looking at that bigger picture, such as improved standards of living and improved health and well-being. And I think in international development work, there's much more of a focus on impact. It's all about impact at the moment. And you do see it creeping into UK work more and more at the policy level with government projects, but it's still very haphazard, and even then it's not necessarily implemented very well at the moment. And I think the other sort of lesson from international development is there's no worry about sort of linking your very small local project that might seem slightly insignificant with how that really helps to contribute to solve some of the big global problems that we're facing, such as reducing inequality and the climate crisis. And you can see that with these types of targets that the things like the Sustainable Development Goals set. And actually, I think that approach to work is really inspiring, not only for those who are working on the projects, but also for communities and stakeholders involved, because they're able to see that, they're contributing to something much bigger and they're doing their bit. So how do you find the solutions that are going to create this impact? And I'd say not by picking them out of thin air, which still happens a surprising amount. And I think it's a really important element of regenerative design, is about making sure that you're making informed decisions to arrive at your design, your project. But justified, robust, transparent, evidence-based decision making is well established in policy, and there's numerous examples. But one of the tests of soundness that all local plans are judged against by the planning inspectorate. And there's also a large number of tools that can help you do that and help you map your journey and make sure you're trying to achieve your desired impact. And that's things such as theories of change and logic models and logic chains. And all those things, they can be a bit intimidating if you've not used them before. They can look a bit scary, but actually they don't need to be. It's just a very simple process of sort of mapping out your project activities and your intended effects. And really importantly, just writing down your assumptions that you're making. And it can be as simple as a table in a Word document. It need be nothing more, but just the process of actually trying to articulate what you're trying to do is useful in itself. And it leads to a sort of very robust and transparent way of decision making, which is helpful for both yourselves and also for others, because that transparency allows these things to be, your assumptions to be tested and challenged, and also it allows monitoring and adaptation. And it's so important, because our assumptions about what the problem is can so often be wrong or slightly going in the wrong direction. And you're probably wondering on this slide what links some post and clean, safe drinking water in Africa. But I was working on a project quite a while ago now on water poverty in Tanzania. And we sort of did the usual process of looking through policy, scouring the river basin management plans, abstraction management plans, or the abstraction licenses, expecting to make recommendations on them on how they could be improved and how this would improve water supply. But actually they all look very reasonable. So we were still left wondering why there was sort of water supply issues. And then we found out eventually that actually the abstraction licenses weren't being monitored or enforced. And we dug a bit further, and then you find out that actually the reason they weren't being enforced was because the staff responsible for monitoring and enforcing the licenses couldn't afford petrol for their cars to go and do the enforcement process. And then you wonder, well, why couldn't they afford petrol for their cars? And that's because nobody had paid a water bill for 7 years in that area. And then you're left thinking, well, why has nobody paid a water bill for 7 years? And it was actually because the postal system had collapsed 7 years ago. So suddenly your project takes on a very different look, and your project to sort of reform the water system actually looks more like a postal system reform project. So it can have quite different consequences. So I think one thing with evidence-based decision making is that there's a concern that following the evidence is somehow not creative, and that's not how creativity works, and it will really drag things down, and and it'd be very uninspiring to work that way. But actually, I think that's completely wrong. I think evidence and creativity go hand in hand, and if you fully understand a problem, that's when you can start to imagine new ways of doing things. And equally, sort of when you're doing the same thing over and over again and hoping for a different outcome, you also know that you've got a problem. And I recently came across a nature recovery plan, which is this new, shiny, going to solve all the problems area of policy with these nature recovery plans. And a huge amount of effort had gone into updating previous biodiversity planning and reprioritising habitats, diligently filling all the gaps in the data, updating everything, and then they managed to come up with a plan that was 90% the same as their plan from 10 years ago. And this is in the face of a biodiversity crisis. And the plan from 10 years ago didn't work particularly well. So you're left questioning why anyone thinks that this one will work any better. And so I think the message is to imagine new ways of doing things. You don't just need to collect information. You really have to analyze it and think about that impact. You have to ask questions, test assumptions, ask why, look at all the connections, barriers and opportunities. And I think sometimes what happens is people get swamped in the complexity and the sheer amount of information and data that's out there. Yet we still want more data, but we need to make sure we don't hide behind a lack of data. We do know that there are big problems. We know we've got a biodiversity crisis. We know we've got a climate crisis. And so a sort of perceived lack of information shouldn't stop us acting. What we need to focus our efforts on is missing data, missing information that's going to help us take us forward and reach that impact. And I think one lesson from working in places where there's often very little data and usually a policy vacuum and you're left with very little to go on projects is that you put a lot of emphasis on talking and involving those who the project will affect, because you know your data is incomplete and you know that it's not going to be telling you the whole story. And so I think my last point is that, you know, I think we really need to work on being really inclusive and participatory in our work and focus on the communities that our designs and our projects are actually going to affect. And I just don't think we're very good at this in the UK. We often assume that we understand the needs of the communities, that we even assume we know who the communities we're dealing with are. We might even be looking in the wrong direction on that. And also that sort of one consultation survey is enough, and that counts as participation. And we really need to find a way of having a deeper understanding of those who our projects will affect. And that includes the difference between those who have an interest in our project and who has influence. And they can be two very different things. And we need to get out of our silos and really you know, take a really truly participatory approach, and that will help us lead to sort of new perspectives and new ways of doing things. So that's all from me. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Louise. That was really great. You talk about impact, but what happens when you don't know what the solutions are?
That's a really good question. I think sometimes we miss a trick in that we don't look enough at other disciplines, or we don't look at academia. There's often quite a divide between those who are sort of in consultancy doing the work and academia, but actually, you know, others have spent a long time looking at a lot of the problems we're facing. And also other phases of the design process. You know, we're siloed, not just in terms of our sort of knowledge, but also in terms of the phase of the design process, whether we're working strategically or at a more project level. But actually there can be lots of answers for questions that we have there, and that will really help us reimagine things. And I guess one example of that is I was recently working on a strategy on community and social forestry in Southeast Asia. And community forestry is often used for communities where there's a lot of conflict, and it's used as a community building tool, a poverty reduction tool. But actually it delivers really well for the environment, on biodiversity, reducing deforestation. It's a brilliant tool. And so actually we were sort of looking at mainstreaming this tool for those things, for climate change, for deforestation, and taking it out of its box really, because actually it delivers across the board, but it had been pigeonholed as a sort of an approach. But actually, if it was brought into the mainstream, it could have significant impacts across our regions. And so I think it's that sort of thing of thinking about things that might already be out there being used, than actually just looking at new ways to apply them.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much. We will see you shortly for the Q&A. I will now invite our final speaker to join us on camera, Josie Warden, Head of Regenerative Design at the RSA. Hi, Josie.
Hello, thank you.
So Josie is at the RSA, where she founded and leads the Regenerative Futures Programme. This newly launched programme is working across sectors with business, policymakers and civil society to demonstrate their potential and build the capabilities needed to work regeneratively, thus enabling people and communities to be sources of health for all life on Earth. Looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thanks very much. Really nice to be here. So I'm going to talk a bit about the principle "there's no place for silos" and explain a bit more about why we need to move from this space into the sort of space where we're thinking, acting, and being more in relationship with one another and with the planet. And I think this quote from Donella Meadows, who is obviously a leading thinker on system change, really exemplifies where we are at the moment and the challenges that we have, and really shows that actually the kind of ways of thinking in a silo is actually at the heart of some of the challenges that we've been looking at and that we find ourselves with today. So to explain a little bit about us, we are the RSA, and we're a social change organisation, and we work to unite people and ideas to address the challenges of our time. And we work with around 30,000 fellows all around the world who are working on their own initiatives in kind of support of this wider vision. And to an extent, kind of bridging silos is really part of our DNA. So people often get a bit confused by our title because they say, well, how do arts, manufactures and commerce all fit together? That feels like a huge remit. And so it's interesting that I guess we're interested in how people from all different disciplines can work together, and we think it's essential that that happens in order to create change. And it also shows that our current ideas of how we kind of chunk up ways of thinking has really changed over the centuries. So we were started in the 1750s, and at that point it really wasn't unusual to think about arts and sciences as being really interconnected, but today we often think about them being very separate. So I think when it comes to shifting away from silo thinking, it's good to recognize that the way we think now isn't really isn't something that has existed for a really long time. And so why do we think the kind of silo, moving away from silos, is particularly important for regenerative thinking? We think it's because regenerative approaches recognise that there are two really key things about the nature of our world and the challenges that we're grappling with. And this is what separates regenerative thinking from kind of what Andrew set out at the beginning, the other ways of approaching the challenges of sustainability. And it sets it apart from the kind of current dominant mindset that exists in the world, which often is much more akin to seeing the world a bit like a machine with moving parts that we can kind of interact with and shift and change in the way that we want. And so I think similarly as I think Andrew mentioned this too, that it's really about a mindset and a way of thinking and a way of seeing the world that actually then sets you off on a slightly different direction to the one that we've been in, and that we think is really helpful for moving forward. So firstly, the mindset shift is around seeing the world as interconnected and nested. And so this means that elements exist in relationship to many others and are influenced by and then influence others more widely. So we could think about this in terms of our heart existing within our circulatory system, inside our body inside our family, inside our community, etc. They're all parts that exist in themselves and actually kind of whole parts in themselves, but they only make sense and only fulfill their potential really and their purpose when they are seen as part of that interconnected whole. Similarly with a house within a street, within a neighborhood, they're really interdependent. You cannot separate them without losing a bit of their integrity. And then the second element is that seeing the world as a living system, so not as a static machine, but something where ecosystems, where individual plants, where river courses, where human communities have always evolved and will always continue to evolve. So this is a shift in mindset from seeing the idea that as we grapple with climate change, we need to kind of fix this machine and then we can kind of continue on as we were before. It's actually about really regenerative approach is really thinking about how you can build the capacity for life to continue to flourish and evolve in the long term. And we think collective sense making is really important for this way of approaching, because when you come to regenerative approaches, it's about thinking kind of addressing problems in a slightly different way to the one we're used to. So we're very good at addressing problems slightly more on the left-hand side. So the akin to the kind of this myth of the blind men and the elephant, where each of them felt a bit of an area of the elephant, and one thought, oh, this leg, it must be maybe it's a tree, and someone else said, oh, maybe this is the trunk, maybe it's a snake, but then together they could say, oh, I've analysed all of these different bits. Let's together make sense of what we're finding and what we want to, and how we should act in this situation. So we're quite good at doing that. We're quite good at separating things out and then trying to make sense of an overall thing. But the challenge that we have with living systems is that actually there is no sort of single truth or sort of perfect system to find. When you start kind of trying to analyse what's happening with something like climate change, you realise that actually there are all of these different ripple effects, and once you've kind of tried to make sense of something, actually the system has shifted and things have moved. So you need to work in it in a slightly different way. But the reason you need to bring lots of different people around that is because you can then all from different perspectives start to make sense of what you're seeing, and people will see different opportunities and different ways forward. And I think that's also crucial with regenerative futures and regenerative approaches, is that there isn't going to be a single way that we should do things. It will really depend on context, on the place, the region that things are made, on the roles of the people involved, and that nature teaches us that actually there are multiple different landscapes, different ways that we can live, but we can do that in a way that they all connect together to create this greater whole. And I'm going to give a few examples of kind of how interdisciplinary and sort of not siloed working can help with this approach. So to start with, this approach can really help bringing together different disciplines, can help create visions and unlock new ideas of thinking. So Jerry might be pleased to see the Eden Project here, and the Eden Project works really well to bring together arts and science with culture, with music, with biology, to think about and inspire people to think differently about the way that we live. And this is the Eden Project as I saw it when I was a kid and went to visit it nearby. And it really kind of opens up the potential to think differently about things. The second example is around practices, perspectives, experiences, and how this can give agency to people to kind of build their own capabilities. And so this is an example from Nudge Community Builders in Plymouth, who are a social enterprise, and they are working with people from across the city to renovate a nightclub which was within a very rundown area of the city, and then thinking about how that whole street district can then also integrate within the wider city. And they're doing it in a way which brings together not just the usual stakeholders who might be involved in development, but really rooting it in the community around what the kind of community want to see, how this can kind of contribute not only to their lives as individuals, as a community, but to the role of the city and the role of the city within the wider region. So it starts to kind of build up those nested layers that you see within regenerative thinking. And critically, it's about bringing in different kinds of evidence, kind of what Louise is building on there, that actually we often overlook some types of evidence like lived experience about what people really know about living in this place. And this approach is trying to bring some of that in too, so that it kind of expands your idea of what your stakeholders are. And it also moves away from the idea that the kind of build itself is the final outcome, similarly to what Louise was saying. It's actually a way of the build becomes a kind of approach to building wider capability within the community, so that more regenerative activity can happen over time, and it becomes a kind of virtuous cycle. And then the final example is around how bringing together different people can sort of shift mindsets and also create innovation. And so this is an example. The lady on the left is called Melanie Goodchild. She's an Isnabeg woman from Canada, and she works with lots of different organisations, including NASA, and she's been working on bringing Indigenous knowledge together with really cutting-edge science to look at how that could open up new ways of understanding and communicating with communities about how climate resilience can be developed. And I think what's really interesting there is that what she calls it is the kind of ethical space between two worldviews. So it's two different perspectives coming together, not trying to compete or overpower one another, but see what can emerge from that interaction. And I think that's a really great kind of exemplification of what interdisciplinarity can do. And I think also on this point, really to emphasize that regenerative approaches, the language that we're using now might be new, but actually the idea is not new at all. It's woven into religions, cultures, traditions, all across the world and all across time. It was something, the way of living in relation to the world has been something that all of our ancestors have done. And particularly it's important to note that Indigenous communities today have really been stewards of this way of thinking, and that this way of thinking also, the kind of oppression that they've experienced also links to kind of shifting mindsets, and the kind of more mechanistic approach that we've taken over time. So there's quite a lot of complexity in those kind of cultural dynamics. But just to sum up, really the point around interdisciplinarity within regenerative approaches is, I think, really summed up nicely with it by a quote from naturalist John Muir, who says, if you once you tug at one thing, you realize that everything is interconnected. It's attached to everything else in the universe. And so as an organization, we're really interested in how we can create the spaces where people can come together to share that interdisciplinarity, to kind of bring their own perspectives and together make sense of what's happening, begin to test and develop new ideas, put those into practice, learn from what's happening, and move towards different ways of working in the future. And I will leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. We are unfortunately running really short on time, so I'm going to invite everybody to join us back on screen for the Q&A. Unfortunately, we're only going to have 5 minutes now, but all the talks have been fantastic. The first question is actually for Josie, so I will start with that. What does it take to break down silos?
I think this builds a lot on what others have said around having a vision, having a co-created vision where people are going is really, really important. And then I think it's about focusing on culture and looking at how you can learn from one another, but also create the spaces where people are building trust and feeling like able to share things, and working on those kind of relationship pieces. But that also requires building infrastructure. So it might be about education, looking at how do you change the education system so that people aren't learning in silos, or in an office, how can you create physical and kind of virtual spaces where people are sharing things. So I think it's kind of on that vision, culture, and kind of infrastructure layer maybe.
Mm-hmm. And then the next question we have is to everyone. How can we get regenerative design embedded into planning policies?
I'm going to jump in there. Yeah. Really interesting question. I think that you probably need to start to set out some kind of framework for what you mean by regenerative design. So there's going to be something to do with broad outcomes. And actually, I really, really like Louise's thing about impacts actually as well, going beyond outcomes. But you know, I think there needs to be some kind of framework set up for measuring outcomes and impacts. But that is a very complicated discussion because you know, there was at one point something called the Code for Sustainable Homes, and there are things like BREEAM around, and BREEAM is now it's going to really piss off anyone from the BRE, but it's seen as a slightly blunt tool because it's a tick box system. So I think you know there needs to be there probably needs to be some kind of government department for regenerative design who has a sort of intelligent approach to measuring this before you could start actually regulating it. But I'd be interested in what other people think.
Yeah, and I think actually, you know, there's some really, I think you're absolutely right, Jerry, and you need to establish what you actually mean by it. But I think there's some really simple steps actually taking those principles that would help planning really move forward, you know. And just the point on silos are the way our planning system works. Planning teams are in silos. People talk about all planners, but actually there's two very distinct groups from very, very different backgrounds. Strategic planners might be slightly more in touch with some of these broader issues about communities and the environment and how you get, you know, building better places. But that's happening at a strategic level. And they are not the people that make a decision on a planning application, who are a very different set of planners with very different backgrounds, you know, often a very different sort of skill set. And you would be amazed how often they don't talk to each other, even if they're sat in the same building. You know, they operate independently a lot of the time. There are exceptions, but actually, even if you could reduce the silos in a planning team, then some of these ideas that are sort of integral to regenerative design would actually probably filter down to what's happening on the ground a bit better. So I think just taking those principles and trying to squeeze them in wherever possible is a sort of first step.
I'd add to that, I completely agree with what both of you say, Louise and Jerry, but I guess the thing I'd say is the kind of link to other processes and other mechanisms. I think some of the regenerative design things are so similar to things that we might do in terms of nature recovery and nature-based solutions and green infrastructure. It's looking at what sort of systems already kind of work and what sort of port upon can be transferred as well as part of that. But
and then the next question we have, would you welcome a system that gives a sustainability rating to houses that would be linked to rates or similar to incentivize householders to pressure developers? Would that work?
Well, who's asking that? That is a tough old question, isn't it? Okay, O'Reilly. Linked to rates. I love it. I mean, maybe, I don't know. It'd be great for someone like us, you know, and one of the problems at the moment is, the honest truth is that from our point of view, because we do, you know, sustainable development, is that when you're doing the red book value, which is when your development's assessed, right, for like the finance and everything, the red book value doesn't take into account whether something's more sustainable or not. So honestly, that would be brilliant for someone like us, because it would give us a lever to push sustainability more in a project than we currently have. What do other people think?
Yeah, I think it's a tricky one as well, because I mean, I've been working on biodiversity net gain and on the environmental benefits for nature tool and things, which are all trying to track, but actually they're still only looking at quite small, you know, taking ecosystem services, but it's still actually quite a narrow approach to whatever sustainability is. And even with that, when you're considering environmental benefits for nature tool, it's 18 ecosystem services, which might seem like quite a lot, but you're still going to have trade-offs. And actually, it's all about context and what's most important for an area in terms of. And so I think it's very difficult, isn't it, to say that there's one right answer, and you know, and it is always all comes back to context and what's most important for that area. So I think it's a nice idea. I'm not sure how you ever implement it fairly.
Yeah, I think
It's a
I agree
tough
with that.
one. So unfortunately, that is all the questions we have time for. We will send these to the panelists to have them answer them afterwards, because we did have a lot of good questions through. Thank you so much to our brilliant panelists today. I was fascinated by every one of your talks, and feel quite hopeful about the future, even though there's a lot of work to do. Thank you to our attendees for joining. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Just a quick reminder to please fill out the feedback survey that you're going to receive an hour after the webinar. And the next session in the Green Dialogue series is on March 24th. And our panelists will be discussing the incoming task force on climate-related financial disclosures regulations. Almost got it all, which will reshape mandatory environmental disclosures across the UK's largest businesses. You'll be hearing from leading regulators on best practices and the future for TCFD, as well as the industry's take on getting started and some of the challenges. Further details, including speakers, will be published on the RSK website shortly. Again, thank you so much to everyone for joining us, and hope to see some of our attendees again in our next session. Thank you.
Thanks.